Today on Living History, we're speaking with Joerg Wuttke.
And all my friends that studied sinology were accepted. I was the only person that was rejected because I had an unrealistic job wish. I wanted to become a manager in China. They rejected me because they said, what do you want to sell these people? And looking back, it was just wonderful to get rejected by these foundations, because I think that was the magic potion that got me going for a career that would have never unfolded if I would have taken the straight road.
Today on Living History, we're speaking with Joerg Wuttke, who first came to China in 1982. Joerg has led the German chemical giant BASF in China, where he guided its investment strategies, negotiated large projects from the construction of power plants to trains to subways, and managed its government relations. Joerg was also the chief representative of ABB in Shanghai. He is a founder of the German Chamber of Commerce in China, and until recently, he was the president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, which has over 1,200 member companies. Joerg is well known in China for his frank and expert takes and frequently is quoted in news outlets all around the world. And about his many memories and experiences in China, we're very happy to speak with him today. Joerg Wuttke, welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I was really intrigued to find out that while you didn't grow up in China, China was really already present in your childhood home. I read a story that your father and your brother were arguing about it. That's very special. Many people weren't interested in China in those early days. Why was that different for you guys?
Well, I think we grew up in I grew up in the southwest of Germany, Heidelberg, in that region. My father was in the army, and somehow he was a man whose childhood was disturbed by the Second World War, and he was an autodidact. He really loved to read a lot, and he particularly was fond of Chinese philosophers. Now, why he was fond of Chinese philosophy escapes me. He was just fond of philosophy in the first place. And my brother, who's 15 years my senior, was a guy who, of course, in the late 60s was infected by the student movement in Germany that was very fond of Maoism. So they all had this book and were basically waving around. And of course, the more rightish kind of father and the more the leftish brother then argued. And they were basically arguing over China. I was intrigued that a very distant country triggers this kind of discussion. And that was the first time I came across the word China and the notion that China is something worth discussing.
How did you imagine China to be in those early days?
Well, I was a kid. I mean, I was about 8-9 years old. It took a while to form shape, but of course, TV was all about Mao Zedong. It was all about distant and exotic. And again, I think when you are growing up in the countryside and in more dull circumstances, something like faraway countries is really appealing. And I was very lucky to have a tennis partner who just came back from Afghanistan in the late 70s. And he was an anthropologist teaching basically how tribes are forming, and he had very strange friends who studied Indian and Chinese and Thai. I mean, where do you come across this kind of people? And I thought, like, yeah, maybe that gets me out of here. And that's why then in 1980 I decided to give it a shot and study Chinese.
And to be precise, you studied sinology, right? And
yeah, well, I mean, sinology in those days was basically Tang Dynasty poems. It was old history, and it was just incredibly complex. It was not my thing, honestly speaking. I started in Tübingen and then moved on to Heidelberg, and I became father shortly afterwards. It was clear to me this is not going to work, you know. So sinology, I actually had on top of it the wish to do politics, but that was boring as well. So I decided to swap to economics, and there I got a taste for business. And I had the great luck that the professor actually organized a tour in 1982 by train from Heidelberg all the way to Shanghai, crossing the Soviet Union and Mongolia in order to get a feel for the country. And that was basically where I loved the country, and I ditched sinology and I thought, okay, let's do something, learn Chinese, learn something else, go into business, study business administration. Mm-hmm. And that was in about 82, 83. And when I came back from China, infected with the China bug, I then applied for a stipend to study further in Shanghai. And all my friends that studied sinology were accepted. I was the only person that was rejected because I had an unrealistic job wish. I wanted to become a manager in China. And in two institutions, Friedrich Naumann Stiftung as well as in the DAAD, they rejected me because they said, what do you want to sell these people? And I had a very energetic mother. And she said, this is unacceptable. What can we do? And I said, maybe I move to Taipei because Taipei is Chinese language. At that time, I had an 8-month-old son. And I actually can work, and my wife can work as well. And looking back, it was just wonderful to get rejected by these foundations because I had the privilege of experiencing a Chinese civilization and culture minus communism. It was a strong middle class with all these Chinese rituals. Just imagine, Mao Zedong with the Great Leap Forward and the Great Revolution, Cultural Revolution has basically rolled over the kind of Chinese patterns and habits and so forth. In Taipei, it was all lived, So I had 1 year studying Chinese in Taipei, absorbing the real Chinese civilization, even though the political circumstances it was a dictatorship by the Kuomintang.
And you learned to speak Chinese very early on, but then I guess you learned to read and write traditional Chinese?
Yes, it's Fangtizi, the long characters, the real thing, so to speak. So I feel very privileged to be able to read that stuff to some extent, of course, not as much as I wish. But again, I went back and then went for a vocational training, 3 years with the company and the University of Mannheim to get into business. And that got me involved with ABB. ABB sponsored my education. And then they dispatched me to Shanghai and Hong Kong and Beijing in 1987. So in a way, I was very lucky to actually detour, get away from the kind of straight line of university education, then find an academic job, and zigzagged through my life with Taipei, with business, and totally different education. So in a way, looking back, I think that was the magic potion that got me going for a career that would have never unfolded if I would have taken the straight road.
I'm going to get to you arriving in Shanghai in a moment, but I had a previous conversation with Michael Kahn-Ackermann, who was describing to me what sinology studies in Germany were like, that his professors couldn't speak.
Yes.
That you wrote that there was no book on Chinese economics.
Yes. Yes.
What was the mindset of people at that time? Were they not interested in modern China at all? Was it only about classical studies?
Well, just remember in the 50s and 60s, China was closed up. You couldn't get in. So why would you speak Chinese if you can read Chinese and try to study the culture, the poems, the pictures, the drawings, and so forth? And my first professor in Heidelberg was Günther de Bon, who was a specialist on Tang Dynasty poems, Su Dong Po and Li Bai. And so looking back, I was grateful for him that he actually tickled my interest, but I didn't find it very funny to translate that because it's very complicated. The old Chinese is written from right up, top down, and then no point, no comma, no nothing, and it was very complicated. But was not my thing, But they instilled in us a love for the Chinese culture. They were backward looking for sure, but the level of information from present day China was so little that I think just one guy wrote a book about Mao Zedong. That was it. To read about business in China boiled down 1985 to 3 books. That was it.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's literally you were stepping into a black hole.
Yes.
On the one hand, for you couldn't know what to fully expect, but also the people you ran into, you were practically from another planet.
Yeah.
How would you make friends in those early days?
Yeah. But it was really a different planet. And I recall in September 1980, when I actually told my mom that I'm going to study Chinese, she broke out in tears. Luckily, we were in a public restaurant, so she had to behave a bit. But it was a bit, annoying that she thought that I lost my marbles. It was fascinating to enter a completely different world. And you were a pioneer at that time. We were about 20 people studying Chinese in Heidelberg. And it was just new, and it was all about Mao Zedong, or it was all about old China, So it was just incredible that you could actually read all the books on China that were available in German. And of course, now it's basically every week a book comes out. And so in a way, we did this tour through China. We studied Chinese, of course, but we went to a lot of places. And in 82, what was really striking was the curiosity of the Chinese people. They just came out of the Cultural Revolution, and they had incredible curiosity. I remember I was traveling with a good friend. She was blonde, very pretty, and we were not dating, but we were really close. And two Chinese students came to us and were asking about all kinds of things about relationships, and they ventured into homosexuality. What is it like? And we talked about San Francisco and so forth, and they couldn't believe it. Unbelievable, What are they doing? What are they? What kind of music do they have? And they left completely shocked, holding hands. So it was natural at that time to actually have a more physical contact. So we made friends like this because the Chinese were just not used to foreigners and came to us. So we didn't even have to come to them. We were always constantly swarmed by curiosity.
That is very striking, because people had just emerged from a time where if you were interested in having a relationship as a young person, you would be criticized for not being focused on Mao Zedong fought enough, where the thought of dating before marriage, never mind homosexuality, was completely taboo.
Totally alien, yes. And it was funny because, the lady was called Barbara. She married my professor later on. We were sitting together. We just enjoyed our company. And then the Chinese came to us in Shanghai and said, "Why don't you marry?" And I said, "Why should we marry? We're friends, Oh, you should marry." Back and forth and back and forth. Turns out to be they wanted to make a movie about foreigners being able to marry in China. Oh. So we moved to Yangzhou, and have a nice backdrop, and we married with all these regalia that you have to put on and stuff like that. But it was just, we opened doors, and they opened doors for us. It was an encounter on a very subtle and sweet level, I must say. It's looking back, sure, you always look back with nostalgia, but it was really different. It was an opening up atmosphere in the air.
Take me to 1986. I think that was the first China International Book Fair. That was your first time doing business in China?
Well, not really doing business. A publishing trust, a religious one, was trying to sign me up. It was from the Baha'i faith, where I was very active at that time. And they wanted to basically get books translated and distributed in China. So I was in 86 in Beijing, and it, of course, was very exciting. Vice Premier Li Peng, who later became Prime Minister, and the Slaughterman from Tiananmen was the opening act. And I, for whatever reason, managed to sell a book. They were interested in this Baha'i religion, and then it was translated, and it was even printed, and it was supposed to come out in summer of 1989. And of course, the shooting basically buried this. The book never saw the light of day and was buried somewhere. But at the same time, I got a whiff of what it is to get a license agreement going.
And this was a very special book. It had a designation Nebu.
Well, Nebu is internal because it was religious, and the Baha'is are Iranian origin, Haifa-based Israel religion that is little known. And the Chinese were curious about it, because they have a very strong emphasis not getting engaged in politics. That might have appealed to some people. But clearly, it was deemed to be a little bit too questionable what impact it has, because China certainly was not allowing major religious activities. And hence, it was Nebu, meaning only available for a very small group of people.
I don't know if it's too forward for you, but what were your politics in those days and when you were a young man coming to China?
Well, in 82, I was lucky to be in Beijing in September, where they had a party congress. Every 5 years, the party congress. Red flags all over the place, no cars, lots of bicycles. And at that time, the party secretary was a gentleman called Hu Yaobang. A gentleman who lost his job in 87 as a matter of fact, and died 89, triggering the June events. A man who was very, very unusual. He, for example, advocated to get rid of chopsticks because this is not very smart. Let's use forks, just imagine. And the prime minister was a gentleman called Zhao Ziyang. Both gentlemen disappeared in house arrest years later. And it was all about opening up. These were the days of Deng Xiaoping ruling the opening up process. And again, it was a period of time where nobody had any roadmap, definitely not in business. So that was 82, 86, again, with the book fair, but 87, seriousness. I was with ABB in Beijing and got a taste of negotiations and trying to sell something. And again, at that time, the system was extremely anxious to get taken advantage of by foreigners. So negotiations turned into endless negotiation rounds because they didn't know what to do. There were no real laws. There were no real comparison. So basically, you educated your counterpart in the commercial terms, whereas the Chinese side on technical side was incredibly sophisticated.
I think you mentioned a lady, Madame Sun.
Yes, Madame Sun, famous Madame Sun. She was responsible for power station. We were trying to sell her a turbine, the power station that you can see from the China World Hotel when you look east, district heating. And she was incredibly tough, and she challenged us. She said, we have been as technical offer missing A, B, C, D. And my colleague then opened the folder and then turned on the right page, turned it around, gave it to her. And she could realize actually it was on the bid. She looked at her chief engineer and slapped him in front of all of us, turned around the file, gave it back to us. Let's continue. She was really tough, unusual.
It is very interesting to hear that the Chinese side was so worried about taking advantage of, because that's what you hear a lot from Western businesses that came in the 90s and the 2000s. Keyword being intellectual property, trademark issues, all those kind of things, or simply I invest into a company and the assets they told me aren't actually there.
Yeah.
Where did this fear come from? Where did this mistrust come from? And how did you guys deal with it?
Well, it was definitely inexperience. I mean, to deal with foreign companies, major deals, you make a mistake, you pay for it. And so you better be on the safe side. It means that you have a lot of time to spend in order to explain that and also to realize where the problem was. There was a big bureaucracy behind every person. And again, making mistakes was not in the cards for these people. I had the same experience when I negotiated with BASF this $3 billion investment in Nanjing, 96 to 2000. And we were all basically a bit of a training center. It was 6 companies starting the race in 95, 96, and major cracker chemical sites in 6 different locations. And of course, there were no real laws that covered this kind of investment. So by doing that, actually, with 6 companies, they could sort of benchmark who does what. And at the end, 3 made it. It was the Europeans, Shell, BP, and BASF. Because of the Asian financial crisis 97, the Americans, 2 of them completely vanished. And the third one, ExxonMobil, took a break and came back much later. So in a way, in China, to do something unusual, new, is always coming with massive risks for the other side. And you have to honor that as a foreign businessman on the other side. You have to be sympathetic for it.
Well, they also came from a very different upbringing. You went to university. You studied business administration. Yeah. They went through the Great Leap Forward, right? They went through the Cultural Revolution. A lot of them were probably sent down to the countryside. Did you ever have conversations about how they got to that table?
At that time, the technical level was outstanding. It was still basically obtained in the 50s and 60s, Certainly heavily Soviet trained. Heavily experienced. I mean, just look at Prime Minister Li Peng at that time. He studied and worked in the Soviet Union. Jiang Zemin as an engineer. It was a revolutionary group with an incredible working ethos that actually was very familiar in technical terms and totally unfamiliar when it came to commercial or marketing and all of the above. That was our part where we had to gradually sort of make them feel comfortable. Engineering was fantastic. And on top of it, they were great because they constantly were working with deficiencies and shortage and how to overcome that. These were very, very flexible people. I admired them greatly.
How did the atmosphere change between the 1980s and the 1990s when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to doing international business?
Yeah. Well, the 80s were the early starts, more unknown areas, but it was with a backdrop of a society which was incredibly open, culturally open, in all respects open. Films that were unbelievable, Chen Kaige and Zhang Yimou, the new films, and then you had incredible movies that were very touching, books and so forth. It was the most open phase in my 35 years, was 87 to 89, but then the shooting happened in June 89. The country went into backstage and basically was dull and dry and not moving at all until summer 1992, when Deng Xiaoping took the Detour in the south in order to kickstart the process. Again, the man changed China in 78 and then had a major blunder in 89 and then saw that his selected people like Jiang Zemin were not doing anything really, and then decided to go south in order to kick butt, so to speak, and got the process started, and then they never looked back again. So it's unbelievable. And then the 90s were gung-ho, really. I mean, anything was possible on business. Nothing was possible on cultural. There was a very big difference. So 80s was more cultural freedom and openness and business uncertainty and basically not knowing how to do things. And the 90s were basically, let's do business, let's get rich, but suppress culture. That was a huge difference.
You mentioned the blunder, which I think is a very interesting word to use for it. How did the business community react? Because you had already told us, companies like BASF were investing billions. We're investing also time. We're putting people here. We're building relationships. What was the conversation after that like? Because you guys were all thinking about, do we walk away or do we stay?
Well, in the 80s, basically, there were no major projects. It simply was no legal environment. The financing was not clear. The market was not clear. It was selling stuff, basically. Late 80s came a little bit of investment. Volkswagen started 84. Beijing Jeep came up. BASF did a little bit in Nanjing, but it was all small and selected and tedious. And that, of course, then changed when the laws developed along. And then in the 90s, of course, there was this kind of let's do stuff. But it really actually took off more at the late 90s and the 2000s, where the big project came, where basically China was on the map. WTO 2001 helped a great deal. And then it was just incredible how it took off. Looking back, I must say it is like people talk about 1978 China opening up and then sort of looking back 40 years. As a matter of fact, I would say at most we can look back 30 years. What has been achieved today is 30 years of development, which makes it even more amazing.
Do you think that something like this is achievable again, or is this the only time we will see this?
Yes, I think it's the only time we can see this. And I was privileged to be part of that. Well, first of all, you need a low base to be spectacularly successful, And we let's forget that actually China's rise, when you look into, for example, GDP per capita in power purchase and parity terms, over the period of opening up over 30 years, was for 30 years identical with the growth of the economy of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, just in different time zones, so to speak. As a matter of fact, benchmarking, mainland actually falls behind a bit, particularly Korea and Taiwan. So the growth pattern as such per capita was not unusual, but it's 1.4 billion people, and not 23 million or 100 million like in Japan, Taiwan, 23 million. So in a way, the spectacular was the size, and the fact that actually, unlike Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, that had a heavily pushing start from the Americans, who were basically controlling these economies at that time. That was Chinese in the essence of the landing patch was Hong Kong. Inspiration was Hong Kong, then came Shenzhen, and from there they started this business. It was genuine Chinese in a way, and they had just very lucky generation of leaders that were ready to go, and they were all engineers. It was a can-do generation, and that made it so special. But why doesn't it go on like this? Well, first of all, they had a unique population structure. One-child policy started in 1980. They had a very low base, so growth was strong. They had the luck of having a very strong Confucian-style educational system, meaning eagerness to learn and an eagerness to get rich. It's the typical Chinese when they wanted to make money. And so that is gone because the driving force of urbanization is gone. We went from virtually nowhere now to over 60%. They added urbanization, they added urban population every year in the size of New York. That really grows an economy. Then the debt burden was much lower. They had an incredible sweet spot of working population. And now everything is different. We are heavily urbanized, so that part is gone. We have a heavily indebted society, business, government structures. And then, of course, we have a declining population. So while we had a sweet spot, enforced also by the One China policy, now it turns against them. Basically, the mistake possibly they will look back to was the One Child policy, because now China's aging fast. Again, China speed fast, and they will now face the fact that in about 5 years, the United States will be younger than China. In 1946, Europe will be even younger than China. And in 64, Japan will be younger than China. And in the year of 2085, the age group that I represent, above 65, there will be more people above 65 than people between 15 and 64. Everything you know about aging of society, the decline of a working population, means much, much slower growth.
Is this inevitable?
Yes. Many things change, but population growth does not change, has never happened before. So they had a one-child policy until recently. Now they have a three-child policy. You should have 3 children. But talk to the ladies, and talk to the people. They don't want to have kids, On top of it, again, not only the one-child policy was a problem, the one-child policy tilted in favor of men. Until they stepped in, infanticide was basically meaning that today we have 111 men and 100 women. So there are much less women in the age group where you can have children, besides they're not willing to have children. So we have basically a situation like in Shanghai, we have a fertility rate of 0.6, which equals South Korea, meaning that since COVID beginning, 20% of all kindergartens in China have closed, and you can imagine how this ripple-on effect is. Again, China cannot help itself. Everything they do is fast.
That is very true, very true. I want to go a little bit back to the 80s and 90s, because one of the things that was also always something that I would hear Western business executives complain about is the requirement for technological transfer, for knowledge transfer. Yes. And there have been a lot of people who basically said, oh, you guys trained your Chinese competitors.
Yes.
Was it worth it?
I don't know who it was. It was maybe Engels who says the capitalist is going to sell the rope on which they will be hanged. And in many cases it was like that. Particularly in the train industry, China negotiated in parallel with the Japanese and the Germans and the French. In the process, learned how trains are built and then built them better than the other competitors. So yes, there were parts of that. But again, I came across quite a number of scandalous IPR violations in bigger magnitudes, even to the point where one at that time fertilizer factory of BASF was copied down to down to the color of the facility, and in Shandong, So yes, production lines. But again, in the magnitude of things, if you were smart enough in order to protect yourself, as well as if you were ahead in technical evolution, always a step ahead of your Chinese competitor, you actually could manage to stay abreast. But again, the companies even like DuPont were copied down the road. So it was the Wild East.
How do Western companies now, a lot of them who are no longer doing well in China, perhaps because they did not innovate, because they stayed who they were, and Chinese competitors basically became the newer alternative, the more modern alternative. Yeah. How do they compete in the future?
Well, it's 1,800 members of the European Chamber, and these are the lucky ones that are here and stay here. But what the Chamber does not cover, and nobody talks about, are all those that have no chance. to come, construction companies, lawyers, basically, many in the service sector, where China has been very much closed up, So if you are in these technologies, which you mentioned that China wants, red carpet. If you are in the technologies which China has, see how you survive, but actually we don't need you. It's a very mercantile society. And so I think now the game has totally changed. From us teaching China in 80s and 90s and early teens about technology, about processes, now basically China has been teaching us that when it comes to applications of technology, they are better and faster than us. So all of a sudden, it has completely changed. They build mobile phones on wheels, and we have to unlearn how to build cars. They're very good at chemical processes. They build fantastic machines. And again, the interesting thing is they hardly ever invent something there's no constructive new development. There is no real research going on, but the Chinese are world champion in development, changing projects,
improving
products.
Improving?
Oh yeah, not only improving, adding new features, being faster, being cheaper. You can give them a decrepit Japanese chemical site and technology. They turn it into a racehorse. That is the genius they have, and that's what we have to learn. My definition for innovation is demand meets brain. First of all, you need the brain, and China has 50 out of 100 top engineering colleges and universities globally. So out of 100 globally, 50 in chemicals, 45 in civil engineering, 42 in instrumentation are in China. China has the deepest bench of engineers, They are just crazy about math and technologies. And then it's demand. I mean, this is where you grow. You try something, you fail. And you have the next customer demand story constantly. I mean, this is what's lacking in Europe. We don't have the demand, and increasingly we don't have the engineers. So innovation is tough. We are still definitely ahead on based research, and particularly in private enterprises. But China has basically realized that on groundbreaking research, they have to do it differently, and that's where the state comes in.
So this is kind of the Deng Xiaoping approach of let's try this and see if it works, and if it doesn't work, we'll try something else.
Yes, and it's fast. And it's, again, that's what I label China became a fitness club. And if you want to learn how to be faster and more nimble and cost effective, and you have to be here. And that's what the German car industry is trying, for example. They're trying to get from a cycle of 4 years down to 3 years to match BYD 2 years. In BASF, they definitely were trying to match the Chinese in getting new products out of the lab, which is mostly applications, so nothing new, meaning get down from 24 months to 15 months or 8 months. Lab to market is something there's no better place in the world but China to learn from, And that now for us, that is the interesting part. We have to be humble enough to say, okay, I'm in the fitness center, China. I'll learn how to do things differently. How can I replicate this in Europe and in the United States? But that requires you to have also basically people here that then can replicate this. And there I see a danger that operations and companies focus on Chinese nationals only, So they operate in China with Chinese nationals, depriving their international manager of the learning experience, the exposure to get the China bug, just to be more risk savvy and nimble. And I think there has to be really a good mix of foreigners as well as Chinese in order to actually make the company as a whole more successful. To basically cross-fertilizing what you learned in China in other parts of the world. A silo of only Chinese management in China doesn't give you this advantage.
Is there an appreciation of that in Chinese management?
Well, of course, I mean, the Chinese are better in operating in China, obviously, but at the same time, you want to learn from the Chinese. And how can you learn if you basically have your people outside China? And that's why I think a good mix is there. And if you are in the CEO position or CFO or in the head of the lab or whatever it is important that you expose your young global managers to this kind of fitness center.
I find it very interesting, especially the part of young managers. And when you were starting out with BASF, you just mentioned you guys were copied down to the last bolt. How did you find out about that, and how did you deal with that? How did you learn to deal with something like that?
Yeah, well, you all of a sudden see that your customers are not your customers anymore, and you wonder, how come they don't buy from you? Well, someone else is selling to them, and happens to be this similar project and product that has been copycatted. The second is just sometimes sheer luck, And I remember this fertilizer plant. At that time, BASF was in fertilizer, was copied. But the engineers in Ludwigshafen, which is the headquarters of BASF, actually did a very smart thing and were basically floating in the community, in the design institutes, fake drawings. Meaning that these poor people in Shandong got hands of this one and built a facility which was deliberately designed that it never works. So there were this kind of tricks in order to avoid that you get copied. You just had to confuse everyone. You never know what it is. And so these poor people came to my office and said, can you dispatch a manager, an engineer, in order to see if we can get this going? And of course we dispatched some. We were curious why they were asking this question. And the guy came back and says, it will never work. I think they wrote off 35 million euro at that time, So it was massive misengagement. So if you're smart, you have ways and means to either float fake drawings or to have such a firewall that you can be rest assured that your drawings remain in your property black boxes, because China has an approval process which is always prone for leaks. So, it can be done, but you have to just be very inventive.
Is this where this Chinese management culture of I keep all the information to myself, therefore I'm indispensable comes from?
There is a tendency, yes. The management structures in China tend to be focusing on loyalty and information silo, and that is a problem. Still they have companies like Huawei and Haier and others that actually manage quite well. But as a European company with this kind of need for cross communication, it is not acceptable. So you have to be a culturally empathetic manager to try to get the Chinese to change the habits that they have without taking away the core competency that sometimes comes from their way of doing business.
What I find interesting about this young generation, relatively young generation of Chinese companies, you mentioned Huawei, is that Huawei, for instance, went to places that other companies wouldn't do business. They went internationally to Iraq, to Afghanistan in the worst times.
Yes.
And tried to generate income any way they could. That strikes me very similar to how Western companies came here in the 1980s with a little more than a hope and a prayer that it would pay off.
Well, there's always a pioneering spirit in upstarts, so to speak, and Huawei was a young company, founded and ran by a charismatic leader with a near-religious culture. Believing in themselves to an extent which I have never seen anywhere else. And again, going into countries like Iran were their undoing to some extent, as they were not very much geopolitically sensitive and went into markets where they should have stayed away from, for example. But again, these markets were open, no one else was there, and they're learning the hard way, and they learn very fast. That's a base pattern is Chinese companies are fast learners.
I want to ask you, what kind of people, business people, managers or entrepreneurs would come to China in those early years, both in the 80s and the 90s? Because you said that a lot of companies chose to not come.
Yes. Well, the first wave of entrepreneurs coming here, business people, were definitely people that were seeking an adventure. It was certainly technicians there as well. You always need the technicians, but heads of companies were mostly Chinese-speaking people that primarily spoke Chinese. That was the first qualification. They knew their way around. They knew how to approach government agencies. They knew what kind of pitfalls there are. And I would say after the 2000s, that has changed. This first adventure venture-driven people have basically disappeared. And has been replaced by either technocrats that actually do also speak Chinese, but they have a very strong technical background, be it legal, commercial, or technical, or by people that just came from headquarters because the complexity and the size of business was growing so much that it became imperative for people to dispatch up and coming management talents here to get them through the fire in order to prepare them for other top jobs. In BASF, when I was starting in '96. The head of China was then becoming Asia board member, and then he became CEO. And we had a history of people that are exposed to this market becoming CEO. As the sitting CEO is someone who resided in Hong Kong and was Asia board member. So in a way, it's if you want to be nimble and fast in this market, you expose yourself, and that might get you to the very top of companies.
You just mentioned BASF, and I find it very interesting that you came at a time that was the go-go area, but also the Chabuduo area. That's good enough. Well, and a lot of rules were not there yet. And of course, when people think of chemical companies, they think of environmental disasters, dangers. Yes. So of course, I asked Chinese environmental activists what they thought of BASF.
Yes.
And I learned the most fascinating thing from Ma Jun, who was basically talking about, no, Joerg Wuttke never had a scandal at BASF. They were very responsible. Yeah. They started a round table which sensitized Chinese political leaders for the importance of protecting the water quality. Yeah. And he was mentioning even Angela Merkel started approaching him after she talked with you.
Well, there was an anxiety at the beginning. I remember '96 when we negotiated in Nanjing, one of the technologies was rejected because it was supposed to put too much salt into the Yangtze River, and all arguments to showcase that actually Ludwigshafen is on the Rhine River. All the chemical sites in Europe are on major rivers, be it the Schelde, the Rhine, or elsewhere. They didn't buy it, because they had lots of experience of accidents, and definitely after what was in '97 when they had the spill in Jilin that basically made drinking water in Harbin impossible. That was a shock. That was a wake-up call, So they grew up with accidents. For example, also the explosion of a chemical site in Nanjing, in Tianjin, that basically made people very nervous. So there was a strong sense of not in my backyard, But I guess that the way major multinationals were operating their sites here actually allowed them to operate. This was the license to operate, to be here and showcase it. I negotiated Chongqing. $1 billion investment of isocyanates by BASF was unusual, 100%. Around 2006 to 2010, 11, it was at that time Xilai's pet project. And it ran into massive arguments, We never knew actually, was it because of Xilai being the sponsor, or was it because of the possible spillover effect in the Yangtze, which is very important because if there's an upstream accident, a chemical site, it ends up in a soup at the Three Gorges. I could fully understand the implications there, but I think that companies, particularly BASF, developed a reputation that it was trusted, So it took Angela Merkel and my CEO in Xi'an, I think it was 2010 when she was visiting, guiding Wen Jiabao through the layout of the project and everything. And Angela Merkel was just so savvy in technology, physicals and chemicals. She had the credibility, authenticity in order to actually convince him to change his mind and let this project go ahead. And this is very successful, no accidents and so forth. So in a way, based on bad experience, they had good reason to be very cautious for chemical sites.
It sounds like German political leaders were quite supportive of Western companies, German companies coming to China. I mean, Angela Merkel came many times, Gerhard Schröder came many times, Rudolf Scharping, right?
Well, Helmut Kohl was definitely someone who definitely connected.
But my impression was that Helmut Kohl doesn't like business people.
I don't know if he was cautious with business people, but it helped us that he's from Ludwigshafen. So he was familiar. He was a work student working in BASF. His wife, Hannelore, was for a while secretary in BASF. So there was a deep affiliation with his home champion, so to speak. So he definitely was doing everything in order to get the deal done, particularly when it came from his region. I remember how he was very, very active while I was working for ABB from Mannheim, which is across the river from Ludwigshafen, that he was really going for it to help. Yeah, but he was not engaging. Schröder was a businessman, really. He was opening doors, and he kept doing this after he stepped down from that. And Merkel was just, where can I help? Where can I create jobs? Where can I protect German business? And she was just endlessly curious about technologies. That's why she liked to come here and see what companies are doing. But she was also at the same time worried about asset stripping and technology gains where Germany would have lost out. She was actually quite ahead of that in comparison to other politicians.
When did that concern start in Western policymakers, in the general population?
Yeah, I think the game changer was KUKA. I forgot which year it was. Possibly it was 2010. KUKA was a robotic company, a local champion in Bavaria. And she actually, when Obama came over and she went to the Hannover Fair, industrial fair, and KUKA has put up a robot who was pouring a wheat beer. That is tricky. It creates a lot of foam. You have to be very slow, make sure. And the robot actually did that. And so high tech of Germany showcasing the ultimate German product, a wheat beer, very impressive. And then the Chinese, my dear, came over and says, I want to buy it. And she was upset. She didn't want to let this pearl go. And she was urging the German industry in the height at the top floor, Siemens and all the others, to pool and actually come up with a counter bid. But the Chinese bid was so high and so attractive that she decided to let it go and let the Chinese buy it. And it was not, I think, to the disadvantage of KUKA or Bavaria, So in a way, it turned out to be much better than people anticipated.
Yeah. One of the German leaders that I didn't expect had come here, but I learned from you, Helmut Schmidt.
Yes.
And this is a country where choosing the right works, building the right relationships is very important. And Helmut Schmidt is famous for being very direct.
Yes.
How did that go over?
Well, that definitely was very direct. A man of great curiosity, major knowledge. And again, I think he was here the first chancellor, as a matter of fact. When he was still sitting chancellor and in the 70s. And he was always very fond of personalities. He adored Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. He definitely was very, very starstruck with Deng Xiaoping, to the point where actually he felt like the way that the Chinese army clamped down in June '89 was the right way to do it. Brought stability. That was the only discussion point that we disagreed upon.
Really? He did say that?
And so he forgave the Chinese from this situation. And he just liked to have these kind of intellectually challenging, thinking in historical terms, leaderships, and that was something which he found in the Chinese leadership with Deng Xiaoping and Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. And that's why he came here endlessly. He came virtually every year.
I'm sorry, I have to ask more about that, because I can understand when somebody says this is a screw up and I forgive people for that. Yeah. But you said Helmut Schmidt thought it was the right thing to crack down on the protesters on Tiananmen.
Yes. Well, it was in a way, I guess he also lamented about the way that had been done, meaning the shooting of innocent people, but he felt like they needed to crack down to stabilize the development of China. Again, I think he was just starstruck with Deng Xiaoping, saying, we had a revolution going on, we had subversion, and we had to stabilize it. This was a fragile economic and political development, and it was about to get derailed, and we didn't want this, and hence we had to crack down, and Helmut Schmidt agreed.
But there is a difference in a crackdown and sending police with billy clubs into a square and sending 18-year-old boys with rifles and tanks.
Yes.
Right? And so that's why I was shocked by Helmut Schmidt agreeing with how that was executed.
Well, put yourself in my shoes. I was equally shocked when I heard that and discussed it with him. And again, I think that the leadership in Beijing simply didn't have the toolbox in order to deal with that. You know, I was there in June '89. I was on the square. And to me, it looked like a massive uprising of people, very emotional, like Beijing Spring, so to speak. And then it fiddled away. It got hotter in May, and there was martial law, and you know the students to some extent left, and poor people from the provinces came over, occupied the square, and they were misled by the fact that actually this first wave of army soldiers driving into the city were stopped at the intersections and sent back. And that was the shock for Deng Xiaoping personally, that he couldn't control the army anymore. And if you're a communist, it's one thing that you appreciate is control. And so he changed the soldiers. He then called on these veterans from the Vietnam War from '78. From Guangxi, they came over, and certainly they didn't speak the same language like the Beijingers. And that's where their whole misery started, because the Beijingers were in the belief they can turn the soldiers away again. And these kids from Guangxi were scared and started shooting, and then there was no way back. So in a way, it was tragic. It was definitely tragic. And I misjudged it myself, you know. I didn't see it coming at the speed. I didn't see the ending. I thought it's going to end peaceful. And then I gave an interview for the German TV, ZDF, stating that China goes back to the dark ages. I was deeply frustrated. I left China for about a week and came back. I did not, by any measure, anticipate that China takes off late 1992 and 93 and never looks back. It was just one of many misjudgments I had. That was one of them. Yeah. Another misjudgment, I tell you, happened to me in the 90s. I was hired by ABB to run the Shanghai office, and I was invited by the mayor to see the future of Pudong. And you had to go through the tunnel, muddy land. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. It was rainy. We ended up in a hall, and there was this gigantic wooden structure showcasing how Pudong is going to look like, you know. And at that time, I was just one of very, very few foreigners representing a company. And so the media was all over me, you know, Chinese media, and put on a brave face. And then I remember I whispered to my assistant and says, let's get out of here. These guys are gaga, nowhere in hell, you know. And not only not in hell, they built it even faster and more spectacular, you know. It is something where I learned that the last thing you can do is underestimate the Chinese ability to come back, you know, and to build something gigantic and efficiency and fast. So in a way, it helped me a great deal later, the awareness never, ever to underestimate the Chinese abilities in order to anticipate technology gains in Chinese chemical competitors, for example, you know. I remember so well when we thought that in 97, 98, when Korea went down in flames, BASF bought a lysine facility, chemical high-tech, from Daesung, and thought that now they're in possession of a great technology. A Chinese genius developed an alternate technology based on corn. You know, and you can't compete with a high-tech technical chemical side against someone who uses corn. And of course they went down, you know. The same happened with vitamin C. So time and again, I came across this thing. If you can see the Chinese developing a taste for technologies, actually get out of there. Try to sell it as fast as possible.
I want to ask you one more time about actually the time after 89, 90. You described the atmosphere as gloomy. How did you guys overcome these differences? How did you get back to cooperation? Yeah,
I mean, after the shooting, it was just foreigners left. Business was down. Trust was gone.
Yes.
The population was shell-shocked. I spent most of my time in litigation and negotiations with Chinese customers because, you know, we had retracted our staff from the working sites, and we had to sort of come back. It was just, everything was a bit gloomy, really. And then it went on. I left in late 1990. And watched it from afar, 91, 92, nothing really happened. And then 92, Deng Xiaoping, I immediately saw the chance of going back. And I was hired to come back in March 1993. And there, the sense was anything goes. I mean, it was really the Wild East. And that's fun to be part of that, because in essence, the Chinese people, in particular, the non-political people, are incredibly optimistic, risk-savvy, and curious, And so you had big dreams and big projects, and it was just fun to be part of that. And again, I think that kind of sense and sentiment has to some extent disappeared today, because we're in a different development phase. And COVID has to some extent also basically sapped the energy out of this nation. And we are where we are. Certainly we have pockets of incredible intelligence and progress. DeepSeek stands for it. But otherwise, the economy is really limping along, particularly in state-owned enterprises where you find it hard to become optimistic.
Well, I'm asking you this question because, as you know, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And we are right now in a time period where there's incredible distrust between the West and China. There's incredible antagonism.
Yes.
And it has been overcome after a traumatic event, namely 1989, once before. But what I hear you say is that there was the will from the Chinese side to go out there. There was also another Chinese politician who you mentioned was very open, very frank, and open to be criticized, Zhu Rongyi.
Yes.
We don't have that now.
It was a time where basically these leaders felt like China is way behind and has to catch up. And they were looking at the United States and Europe as a model. And that's where they wanted to be, And so you had leaders like Vice Premier Wu Yi, a lady I admire greatly, that was basically really trying to open up the economy. And then basically around 2005 to 2008, 2009, it was on a higher level, but the break happened during the great financial crisis. I remember very well when I took the CEOs of major European banks to the banking regulator, the very capable chairman Liu Mingkang. And I remember when he said to me, Joerg, you're a very gutsy guy. Your financial system is up in flames and you come to me and have the audacity to do recommendations, And I thought the guy's actually right. Who are we to tell him what to do on the financial sector? And as he's a gentleman, he then said, we lost the model. For us reformers, the decline of capitalism in the West is a disaster, because now we have nothing to show, nothing to tell our leaders where we want to go. And that opened the space for communism and state-owned enterprises and all of the above, And so on the economic side, I think that was the time when really the shift took place of like, okay, we shall not copy the West. The West is cyclical, the West is uncontrollable, and has shown again that actually it comes with a major crash. And the last thing that leadership accepts here is volatility, Xi Jinping was on advice from his very able advisor Liu He, trying to open up the capital markets, and you had 2014, 15, 16, I think $1 trillion left the country in no time, And of course, they had cracked down and realized that the moment you open up the economy to market forces, you inherit volatility. I mean, he thought that let's get people rich. Let's let the stock market in Shanghai go from 2,000 or 3,000 to 5,000. And then, of course, no surprise, it crashed again. Another learning is do not trust these capitalists. And that, I think, reinforced the picture in Xi Jinping. Everything we do has to be along Marxist principles, has to be controlled, And of course, there is no space for Western ideology anymore, On top of it, of course, like President Putin, they witnessed these color revolutions in North Africa and realized, we had this in 89. That certainly didn't come from foreign countries, but maybe foreign countries might instigate the same over here. And we became super careful on this one. So in a way, the West lost its allure, and the sensitivity in the Chinese leadership was at an all-time high. And hence the kind of moving away from our model to what they believe is a better model.
When did the move away from this openness, from this dialogue, that willingness to be criticized also, to this well, almost 1980s Kremlin-like, closed-off, mysterious approach that we're seeing right now become noticeable to you?
I think it became noticeable around 2012-13 when Xi Jinping took over. Two things on that one. Xi Jinping, and my wife is Russian. My father-in-law was Soviet deputy foreign minister. He was a celebrity here. Still, people know him. Funny enough, in May '89, when he was here with Gorbachev, he was in the Great Hall of the People, dining with Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping was on the square. Anyhow, so the trauma, so my father-in-law at that time explained to me, was Khrushchev criticized Stalin.
Yes.
And that was the beginning of the end. So we will not criticize Mao Zedong. There is no 70% right and 30% wrong. It's just everything is right. The second trauma is, of course, glasnost and perestroika. To change an authoritarian system always leads in the downfall. No one better explained this to me than at that time Vice President Wang Qishan. Wang Qishan actually is a man who reads a lot of books, very interesting books, like Stefan Zweig and like Alexis de Tocqueville. And he gave me the book of Alexis de Tocqueville about the downfall of the Bourbon dynasty, saying whenever an autocratic system, be it royalty, be it whatever, it wants to change, normally it ends up uncontrollable, unleashing forces that are then leading to the downfall of whatever it is. We cannot reform our system. We have to strengthen it, And so get away from our ideas that this system is ever going to change unless something catalytic is going to happen. And the third Soviet trauma was basically the Yeltsin years, the kind of privatization, the ripping off, development of oligarchs that had then a TV station, a newspaper, and so forth. And they were running the election campaign of Boris Yeltsin for Xi Jinping, of course, unthinkable, So I think that Jack Ma didn't actually cover that part of the history that basically Putin, like Xi Jinping said, you can be rich, but do not engage anywhere in publicity or in media or whatsoever, So I guess the kind of three Soviet-Russian trauma shaped Xi Jinping's way of thinking, looking at this. And we just have to notice that this is the way it is. So there will be no major political reform. There will be an emphasis on control of private business, and there will be just no criticism of the past.
But every crisis is also a chance, right? And China opened up because Deng Xiaoping observed abject poverty. He had to try something out. We are now in an economical crisis here in China. Xi Jinping is dreaming of the renminbi being a reserve currency. Right? Yeah. These Chinese companies are dreaming of selling their products and services abroad. Something has to change. But you are very, very strongly saying, no, nothing will change. So is China doomed to be a middle-income country for good?
Well, the risk is there for many reasons. One is they have plucked the low-hanging fruits. They have basically pumped up the banking system and has created growth there. Urbanization helped, the demographic sweet spot helped, and now it turns against them. Urbanization is finished, a demographic nightmare just is about to start. Still, we should not forget that even an economy that's certainly much richer at this period of time, like Japan, went into a flat growth model. And I don't actually see that China is going to act differently. I have definitely no China will collapse scenario in the back of my head. But it will enter a phase of very stale growth. But at the same time, we should not forget that even the Japanese had decades of stale growth. They produced world champions as companies. And that's what I think is going to happen. Chinese companies will go global. Chinese companies have to go global to go into the global supply chains, but also to find markets where they can actually earn more money because their backyard is not as lucrative anymore as it used to be. Again, the biggest headwind is just how do you manage a society which is so rapidly aging like no one else? And so that will be the major challenge. And if you look into the 15th five-year plan, they talk about, I think already, about what can we do against this premature, fast aging. happens to be robotics, happens to be AI, happens to be biotechnology. I think they see the writings on the wall and try to see how they bring the country into a position that actually can deal with that transformation.
Do you remember the first Chinese company that you saw going abroad that you developed a respect for how they were run?
I think it was Haier. That was the first company that I would say went global. They bought GE, the white goods segment. And if you look into Chinese companies, it is actually never the government that makes these companies successful. It's always individuals.
Yes.
You know, it is Mr. Ren with Huawei. It is definitely, again, a man I admired, a chemical company, Wanhua Yantai. You had Mr. Zhang in Haier, in Qingdao. Individuals which were outstanding, bringing relatively old technologies to the fore, you know. And then, of course, you had the young kids doing, you know, Jack Ma and stuff like this, Pony Ma and Robin Lee and so forth, that were brought there new. But that was a new business, you know. I admire people that actually made old, seemed to be sunset industries successful, you know. You know, be it telephone, be it mobile phones, be it, they just had the ability of seeing a visionary way how to actually update them, change the patterns, and even something as boring as chemicals got like a racing horse in Yantai, you know. Something as boring as a refrigerator and a dishwasher became revolutionary, different in Qingdao, you know. So entrepreneurs made a difference, and you can see the same also with companies in Taiwan, for example, Stan Shi, or the founder of TSMC. But there's one thing that differentiates the Chinese. The Chinese basically find it very difficult to actually develop branding. That is something where the Koreans and the Japanese have been extremely disciplined and focused, and Sony and Matsushita and LG and Samsung and so forth. You still don't find global champions from China, name recognition, that basically are having a major pricing power, you know. Maybe Xiaomi is going to get there. To some extent, Huawei certainly has done this role. But given the state of the economy, the advance of the economy, the Koreans and the Japanese have, even the Taiwanese entrepreneurs have done this many years before, you know. And part of that is the kind of opportunistic approach of many Chinese entrepreneurs. If something is successful, then they try something else, and it doesn't matter if I go into building structures or I build rocket parts or a cheese factory. It's just like I do it, you know, diversifying the holding, so to speak.
Yes.
But diversifying never gives you the discipline of having a brand, which in essence a brand is a promise. That was the strength of the Koreans and the Japanese. And that actually also led to those companies out of these two economies to have pricing power. Today, very few, if any, Chinese company has pricing power.
It very much reminds me of Dalian Wanda, who, of course, took massive risks, had to also scale back when the financial crisis hit. But a lot of what they did is they licensed Western hotel brands.
Yes.
Right? They did Intercontinental hotels and other hotels. They also have their own brand now, but it's still very much relying on, I use somebody else's branding.
Yes, yes. There are very few companies that have managed to stay branded and focused. And they have basically a more regional importance. Tung Rentang, for example, is definitely a company that is recognized, but not outside China, you know. Yeah. So China is amazing because every third product globally is made in China. If you ask a person in Argentina or a person in Botswana to name Chinese brands, they might find it very, very difficult. So how can you possibly produce 1/3 of all the products globally, but rename a supplier to someone who then sells it as a label? So in shopping centers, you have a lot of international companies that actually buy from China and then relabel it, and all of a sudden it's made in China but not sold by China, you know. That is something that irked Chinese leaders always, you know. A man I deeply admire, and big fan of him, was the former Shanghai Mayor Xu Guangdi. Xu Guangdi said, you know, there is this Stan Scher from Acer in Taiwan had developed a smile curve, meaning you have, when you do research, and the design, you earn a lot of money, which is very high. And then it goes down to production. The returns are very low. And then it goes into marketing, branding, where the returns are very high. It's a smile curve. And it says, where are we as mainland Chinese? Of course, we are in the low part, and you guys are here and there. And his thing was, we have to get out of there. And it's telling that he became head of the Chinese Academy of Engineering, and basically was one of the masterminds of Made in China 2025.
I didn't know that he came up with that.
Yes. Well, he was among some of them, but he was the head of these organizations that did it. Yeah.
You've really dealt with a lot of Chinese politicians over the years. Chinese politicians who you described as being very different from each other. Zhu Rongyu, of course, is one of them. Bo Xilai also, you mentioned when you were at the European Chamber of Commerce.
Yes.
Bo Xilai was a hard ass.
Well, I met Deng Xilai first time when I opened the BASF office in Dalian in 1998. He was mayor of Dalian, a charismatic person, very handsome, according to my wife, and definitely someone who spoke fluent English, to the dismay of their translator, who always got corrected by him. And he was very cocky. He was so full of himself, but he was fun, so I met him again as governor of Liaoning, and then he became MOFCOM minister, and I was chairman of the European Chamber. And I tell you one incident that happened where Peter Mandelson, who was trade commissioner, came over here and they negotiated. And Peter Mandelson was criticized by the Financial Times of basically selling out Europe, and I found this deeply, deeply unfair. And I wrote a letter to the editors in the Financial Times, which was published, where I said that Mandelson had done a good job and just China is hopelessly closed up and not willing to open up. And of course, who reads the Financial Times? Bo Xilai, So Bo Xilai was deeply upset about my letter and called me in. And said, they in the beginning, they always called me in because they didn't like my public stance. And of course, he didn't show up. I was beneath him, but he sent his people to meet me and said, you should watch your language, Mr. Wuttke, and that was not very nice. And I said, I say this, I just reflect truth, as the reality, And then they left the room to tell Bo Xilai what I said. And they said, wait, please, and there's a gift for you coming up. And I said, what is it? And then a handyman came in with a huge box, wooden box, into this meeting room, which had the size of a coffin. And I thought, Jesus, maybe I end up after lobbying in the coffin, But all jokes aside, I said, I don't have the facility in my car to actually transport this. Would you please open it here so I can see what's in there? It took a while to get the toolbox in order to break up this box. And it turns out to be a beautifully made sculpted lotus. So it was done in a very, very artistic style. And I said to the protocol head of MOFCOM, what is this for? And he said, well, the Chinese economy is like a swamp. It might be smelly and it's dark, but, the lotus is pristine and white and sits on top of a swamp. You should be like the lotus and speak nice, that is his message, So that was, of course, I never listened to them and kept criticizing them because I was always in the belief that I'm not bashing China, I'm not lamenting about China, I just feel that China has more potential. I'm a child of the Zhongji area and he criticized China because we always felt like China can do better and they just have to know about it. But of course, thin-skinned politicians didn't take it easy, And then Bo Xilai became party secretary of Chongqing. That's where I met him last time. He was the doyen of our project, and so I had a long overlap with this very charismatic man until he was arrested and disappeared.
But disagreeing is part of doing business, right? And finding solutions to it. What were other moments where you had big disagreements, and how did you solve them?
Well, normally business people in China, even in organizations like chambers, don't want to criticize China, because they feel like they don't like it, which is true. and they might antagonize their counterpart. I always felt like it betrays the abilities of the Chinese people. You let them down. You basically underestimate their abilities to change.
You're saying it's patronizing.
It's patronizing. It's great. Oh, wonderful. Everything is wonderful, And I was constantly harassed by these people of being too critical. I said, I see the potential of China. Why don't you? So in a way, it is something where I never stopped believing in the ability to reform and move on from China. And hence, I always pinpointed where the shortcomings are, but always adding where the solutions are, particularly in the European Chamber position papers, And I think that I gained the respect of Chinese leaders, also because not only did I care about China reforming herself, certainly I stepped on toes of those that actually didn't want to hear criticism. But at the same time also that I was speaking in a language to the Chinese leadership in public and in private, as I talked exactly in the same language in my home media as well as European politicians. There is a tendency of sometimes business leaders talking nice here and bitching behind the back in headquarters, And the best case was when a major multinational leader from Germany, and I won't mention his name, came here, and he was supposed to report in front of Keqiang and Angela Merkel of what are the challenges that German business faces over here, And he fumbled around, great relationship, we love China, and China's great to us, and so forth. That Merkel said, I'm sorry, Mr. So-and-so, you told me something very different in the plane. Would you please give me that version? And the face turned red. And it got worse because Li Keqiang said, oh yeah, I want to hear that, So the Chinese have no respect for duplicity. They want to have a straight shooter because then they can trust him, and that was quite telling.
Well, it's also telling that you always got a new visa. Like, you were not run out of a country. Like, some New York Times correspondents were run out of the country simply for having gone to Wuhan to take a look at what is happening with the COVID outbreak at those days. So there's a thin-skinnedness there. But like you said, you really stepped on toes.
Yeah, I think most people underestimated the ability of local leaders, in particular, to learn and to listen. I remember when I introduced this local position paper in the European Chamber, meaning I said the big one nationwide doesn't really appeal to local officials. They want to hear about electricity prices, healthcare systems, license agreements, and so on locally. Be it Shenyang, be it Shenzhen, or be it Chengdu. Most, in particular in Tianjin, they were in panic mode. How dare you criticize us? To the point where they're bullying our local representatives, the chairs of the European Chamber, in order to retract that and not publish it, And I said to the local chairs, I can fully understand this is uncomfortable for you, but at the same time, the paper is there, it's valid, it is important for the local community, and if they don't do it in, say, Tianjin, I do it for Tianjin with the Wall Street Journal in Beijing. Within hours, we had the approval of Tianjin to do it. They were so scared that I do this with the Wall Street Journal. They wanted the local guy to do it with the Tianjin Daily, of course.
Yeah.
So in a way, this, and then after a couple of years, the locals in Tianjin said, so where's the second edition? They wanted to discuss that. They wanted ideas. They wanted to be seen as someone that gets ideas and actually puts it in action. So I was so happy, in particular in Tianjin, but also in Chengdu, when the local government actually embraced that and demanded it. So there has been many editions of that coming out, but you have to stay firm, because the first reaction is always negative. Don't criticize, because that's what the system is all about. But we as foreigners, if we phrase it well, if we mean well, if we have concrete examples, and we deeply believe that it helps the local economy, why not?
There's always the saying that the foreigners who come to China hoping to change China leave with their hearts broken. But a huge part of your job is literally to effect change, to help companies who were in industries where they were not on an equal footing have a better situation. How do you feel now? Is your heart broken?
No, I grew in the exercise. I certainly didn't have success in many areas, but I fulfilled my duty of pinpointing where China can go better. I feel really like I feel at peace with what I did, and I left behind a couple of very good friends where I knew that they listened to. Again, Xu Guangdi is one of them, and to the point where actually I became sort of the to-go person for the Chinese leadership in order to actually pinpoint something. In a way, it's like this medieval harlequin at the court. Someone has to say the emperor doesn't have clothes on, and it was only me in a way. And I give you two examples. One was the situation where zero COVID took place, and someone in the State Council told me in March 2022 that there was a major study how to get out of zero COVID, 120 pages done by the establishment, so there was a roadmap, and they said we need someone from outside to kickstart this. It cannot be from the inside. Would you please give an interview and say something about it? What do you think? And I said, with all due respect, I love my visa. And this is Xi Jinping's key policy. The last thing I'm going to do is, while Shanghai is about to lock down, challenge him on zero COVID. So, oh, please, would you mind, and so forth. And I said, I see the necessity. And so I looked around and thought, how do I phrase this? And I said, okay, I write to the relevant person at the State Council, Vice Premier Hu Zhenghua, and I will then write a letter to you. And I will propagate what I labeled the Singapore model. It was important to me not to sort of showcase Europe, but to have some model which is appealing to the Chinese. Because in the Singapore model, they had Chinese vaccine and mRNA, both. And in Europe, of course, we only had European. So I said, okay, leave people at home, vaccinate everyone if they have COVID. If they're vaccinate everyone above 60, like there's no tomorrow, and have choice in vaccine, So the letter goes out on the weekend. And on Monday morning, the Wall Street Journal calls me up and says, "You're a great letter." And I said, "What? What do you mean great letter?" "Oh, your letter to Hu Zhenghua." I said, "I don't believe a word you say. Send me the letter." It was my letter in the internet. And of course, the social media shitstorm started. The chairman of the European Chamber is challenging Xi Jinping's core policy. I was not challenging it. I was doing suggestions, So next thing I hear is I was called into the State Council, Minister Ma Jiantang wanted to see me, And I thought to my wife, oh boy, it's getting thin ice, I go into the State Council. And I meet a very, very amicable group of people saying, great letter. It kickstarts a discussion. We don't know if that's going to happen, but at least we talk about it. I leave the room. I get called up by MOFCOM. Minister Wang Wentao wants to see you. Same thing. Great letter. Kickstarts a discussion. There was the willingness of having this person from the outside, not necessarily change in the game, but at least putting up options, On the 8th of May, Politburo decision, zero COVID is here to stay. Okay, fair enough. They decided not to follow this. I kept quiet and did my thing. But it was very telling that actually I was a useful tool to make the leadership discuss something they felt insecure how to tackle that, And that was something where I felt very strongly about. There was another example on a process where they asked me directly. I did an interview in the media and they criticized me. It was too lame. The point of criticism didn't come across clear enough.
This really highlights that you can be a force for good, somebody who affects change. And it makes it all the more stunning that you are saying China won't change. China will not open up. Nothing will happen. Yeah. You've seen change in the past is what I'm saying.
Well, I don't expect change in the sense of a reversal or a complete go back to some other system or model. I don't see this at all. I think the Chinese Communist Party had a knack of adjusting. Steering the process differently, doing reforms by millimeters. That was not Zhu Enji's thing. Zhu Enji was someone who basically really wanted substantial change. He wanted to rattle the cage. I mean, just read up his press conferences he gave. They're published in books. It's just outstanding. It's hard to believe that this was happening between 1998 and 2003. So no, it's incremental adjustments that take place. And sometimes events force their hand to change, like they did in December 2022, when obviously the COVID virus went amok and they couldn't come up with shelters anymore and so forth and so forth. And then they declared victory and left the battlefield, So sometimes outside events like that. But otherwise, basically, they are sticking to their policy and make incremental, very small changes, because any admission that something has to change has to be explained. Was it a mistake?
Mm. Yeah, and mandate from heaven, right? You cannot...
At the leadership, you can't admit mistake. You might point at someone else making mistakes, but the leadership has to be someone that's predictable, even though the whole history of the People's Republic shows many mistakes and changes.
Joerg, I can see how cooperation between the Chinese economy and Western economies has benefited Beijing, has benefited Shanghai, has benefited Tier 1 cities. Has it benefited small town China, the remote provinces?
Well, physically, visibly, yes, definitely. Yeah. I remember when I was putting money together I was with Rotary and I was sponsoring personally very poor areas and happened to be Tibetan regions in the highlands of Qinghai, 1999. I raised money because I realized that kids in the Tibetan highlands have an incredibly high rate of analphabetism. They couldn't read and they couldn't make mathematics, because the parents were reluctant to put them up in Chinese boarding schools and rather took them allowed roaming in the highlands of Qinghai. So the idea was then, okay, if the families and the herds are roaming in the Qinghai highlands, why not the school? So we bought 3 tents, we bought chairs and tables, we bought books, we hired Tibetan teachers, and they were then going as a tribe in the highlands of Qinghai. So first time I was there inaugurating these tent schools. We drove up from Xining to the highlands. It was, I think, 12 hours, 1999. Incredibly interesting because you start in China, you pass very heavily Muslim-oriented 2,000 to 3,000 meters and 4,000 meters Tibetan. It's just amazing. And then I financed it again 2 years later, 2001. I came back. It took me 2 hours. They had a highway in Sikou County in Qinghai, and I couldn't believe it. All of a sudden, the people could trade better, could send the kids to hospitals and so forth. It was not in the middle of nowhere, Still, they were roaming the highlands, of course. But at least the villages there had a clear advantage. Of course, they're still very poor. I would say the majority of people there still have less than 1,000 renminbi a month, Of course, life is very inexpensive and cheap there. But I think one of the hallmark success stories of President Xi is definitely pulling people out of poverty. Of course, doing this with the machinery behind it was kickstarted by Deng Xiaoping and other politicians, but he focused on that, So I think that is really one of his success stories. The second one I would grant him is when you look outside, it's blue sky. Just remember before he came into office. And I was at the Lufthansa Center intersection. Sometimes I wanted to turn left. I couldn't see the red light or the green light. It was 1,500 pp, 25 or something. So
when did that start? When did the pollution start?
It started, in essence, I would say, after WTO, because they started building a lot. And it was just incredible pollution coming out of a couple of sources. One was cement production. China produced basically in 3 years or 4 years more cement than the United States in the 20th century. So massive. Because everything was building. And the second was that basically industrial steam production, electricity production was in Shandong, Tianjin, Hebei was primarily coal-based. So when Xi came to office, basically he was trying to force people to knock down these coal boilers and replaced them with gas-fired steam production and electricity locally, That initially didn't work, and then basically he made it happen in 2012, 2016, and I would say that was the game changer, But it was so bad. And again, the whole denial of the system. The US embassy put a monitor on the roof of the embassy indicating how bad it is. China was complaining it violates the Geneva Convention. I mean, how laughable is that, But it was a game changer because all of a sudden we went from blue sky days, you had to put on blue sunglasses to have a blue sky days, but they said it's a blue sky day, to scientific measurement. And what gets measured gets done. The moment this was there, after a while, population realized, they're kidding us. And again, adjustment of policies, they realized we have to do something about it. And I would say one of the game changers were mentioned by you already. It was this silent, humble man, Ma Jun.
I thought his story was so incredible. And he told me about the pressure he got from some of the provincial officials and factory owners, that he stood up to that he did this.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, he's a hero, definitely. And in particular, his demeanor. I mean, he could be a businessman, he could get very, very rich, and he's one of those saints of environmentalism, really. And
tell me the details about this roundtable that you did with him.
Well, he asked for my help in order to attract the European business community to basically what he labeled the green choice. The supply chain should be cleaned up. The companies have a responsibility doing this. He went after Apple, he went after Hewlett-Packard. I mean, he didn't shy from the big names and named and shamed them. And he named and shamed them in a way which was clearly scientifically based, meaning he used local data in order to then on his internet showcase where the emissions happened, and you were then shamed by being put on that, and I said, that's a cool idea, let's do this. And I assembled these companies to say, okay, let's basically clean it up and make a green choice, meaning go down the ranks and exclude suppliers that are on this list. Just do not source from companies that are named and shamed on Ma Jun's internet, which is not easy because you don't change suppliers easily because the technology is hardwired. You cannot only have that, and you have and the second was basically Ma Jun's insistence that these companies have to do stuff in order to get off the list. My thinking was that if the government is auditing these companies to say they are clean now, they should be off the list. He wanted special activities, which I admire. But in this respect, the roundtable was not necessarily ending in an agreement, but it ended in better understanding, And eventually, I think, he was just so ahead of his time. He made people aware about supply chains being very long, very deep, and being basically something where it's the operator license. I mean, again, now supply chain the topic is not green, the topic is geopolitical. Do you have American components in a machinery that you sell to China? Do you have an American component, a Chinese component in a machine you want to sell to the United States? So there we are. I think we are so much better in environmental audits and credibility. And certainly Ma is the one that has been driving this to a large extent.
Yeah, that gives me really a lot of hope because he was also listened to by the Western companies coming here, doing business here, which I think is also necessary in order to thrive here. You have to give respect to people who are with a pure heart.
Yeah. But he needed a special toolbox, and that was his internet, linking it up with the local environmental protection agencies. And again, you cannot sweet talk companies sometimes into changing their behavior, So for him, it was clear, like if it's scientifically proven, name and shame. Put it up there. I'm so sorry. And renowned companies that basically all of a sudden ended up on the list. And again, he didn't necessarily succeed in getting these companies then sanctioned by others in the supply chain. So, you're on the Majun internet, I don't buy from you. But he got us all thinking, and he got definitely a different ESG behavior going, So there are these individuals, but it also showcases that China can accept NGOs and dissents. That was certainly not easy for Chinese companies to be on his internet site. Just imagine there's an SOE and you pop up on Majun. Normally you send in strong messages like, do you want trouble or what? And again, for him, he had always the blessing indirectly from someone in the establishment to say, we need this change in order to get China cleaned up. And then when Xi Jinping came, it was clear that the blessing came from someone definitely who means business.
Yeah. You have a long history in China. Now you've moved to Washington.
Yeah.
Is China going to be in your future? Are you
yes, definitely. Definitely. It's going to always be part of my life. I mean, you see me here today. I live in Washington. Since I retired from BASF and moved to Washington to be with Madeleine Albright's company, DGA, I have been back 6 times. So I'm privileged to meet again friends and to be part of my long 35-year of history. But I found a change in my sentiment. I love to come here, eat, meet friends, and catch up, and it just tells me every time that you have to be here very often to get a feel and understanding of what has changed. Small incremental changes. But then I get on the plane and I fly home. I'm not at home here anymore. I left China. And so, and in a way, it's maybe, I'm not married to a Chinese citizen, so I don't have that kind of family connections. My wife is Russian. And I always felt like, every year I had to apply for a visa. If you are in Sao Paulo, if you are in Buenos Aires, after a while you become Argentinian or Brazilian. There's no way in hell you ever become Chinese over here. So basically, you're always labeled a foreigner. To 50 Shades of Grey. To what extent, if you are a foreigner, more China-minded, less China-minded, China basher, and that was always very sad. I must say, that this country doesn't have the ability to actually sort of say, they have this green card thing now, but the funny story is, I applied for the green card at one stage, long time ago, and it's easier to get in Shanghai, and in Beijing I was rejected because I didn't have the educational background. I don't have a university degree,
Oh my God.
The chairman of the European Chamber, head of BASF here, didn't get the green card because I was not in the league of a university graduate, so it was fine with me. I never had a problem accepting this. But again, it is just made me aware that home still is my village in Germany.
That's incredible. Thank you so very much for your time. This was really inspirational.
Thank you so much.